The gold ring lay in a bed of wet plaster and splintered oak, bright as a coin at the bottom of a well. Rain still dripped through the broken vestry roof in patient, cold taps, and the whole church smelled of soaked hymn books, lime dust, and old stone newly opened to the weather. Susanna fairly bent, lifted the thing from the rubble, and felt at once that it was too heavy for ornament and too finely cut for accident. The storm had struck in the night and left the parish looking as if a giant hand had pressed it crooked. Half the churchyard wall was down. The west window had lost 3 painted saints and all their dignity. The bell frame, everyone said, must be inspected before a single rope was touched. Yet by breakfast the village was already doing what villages do best. Men carried ladders and gave opinions. Women stood beneath umbrellas and counted damage as if counting it made them owners of it. And somewhere in every little knot of talk, if Susanna passed near enough to hear, there came the familiar phrase, spoken with laughter polished into civility. Wed to her ledgers. She had been hearing it for years. As the vicar's unmarried daughter, she was useful in 100 ways that inspired very little romance in other people's minds. She kept the accounts of the parish almshouse, purchased flour before the bins stood empty, knew which widow needed coal and which old laborer pretended not to need spectacles. If broth was stretched, she stretched it. If soap must last, she made it last. Her hands were neat, her gowns plain, her habits exact. And because she could make a half-crown travel farther than most men could make a pound, the village found it amusing to say she loved columns of figures better than she ever would a husband. Susanna slipped the ring into her pocket and straightened. Across the nave, beyond a trestle of fallen timber, a stranger stood near the shattered wall with a measuring staff in one hand and a notebook in the other. He was dressed without display, in a dark coat rain-marked at the hem, but there was nothing ordinary in the stillness with which he studied damage. He did not gape. He did not fret. He looked and then looked again, as though walls confessed more to him than people did. Mr. Bletcham, the church warden, hurried past, muttering about estimates and subscriptions and the church relief fund. He gave the stranger a deferential bow he would never have wasted on a common surveyor. And Susanna, with the ring warm in her palm inside her pocket, thought, "That is very odd indeed." If you enjoy stories like this, do subscribe and stay with me, because Susanna was about to place that ring into the wrong man's hand for all the right reasons. That oddness stayed with her long enough that she did not go first to her father or to the women gathering cracked prayer books into baskets, but straight across the broken flags toward the stranger by the wall. He turned when he heard her step on the grit. Up close, he looked older than she had thought at a distance, perhaps a little above 30, with dark hair damp from the rain and a face too composed to be called handsome in any easy way. There was a severity in him, though not the unkind sort. His gloves were dusty with lime. A fold of measuring papers protruded from his coat pocket. He bowed, slight and correct. "Sir," Susanna said, drawing the ring from her palm. "I believe this was lost in the collapse." For the first time since she had noticed him, his expression changed. It was no grand display, only a stilling, a sharp inward breath, almost hidden. He took the gold signet from her fingers with far more care than such a plain exchange should have required. "Where did you find it, Miss?" "Fairley. In the vestry rubble, near the fallen chest." "Miss Fairley." He studied the seal, then closed his hand over it. "You have done me a very particular service." She thought he might explain then. Instead, he slipped the ring into an inner pocket, as one secures something essential, and said, "My name is Vale. I am here to survey the damage on behalf of an estate interest connected with the living." An estate interest. It was a curious phrase, careful and bloodless, the sort a solicitor might use when he did not care to say more than duty required. "You are very welcome to your property, Mr. Vale," Susanna replied. "I supposed some servant had misplaced it." A flicker passed through his eyes then. Amusement, perhaps, though faint enough to vanish at once. "No servant, I assure you." He reached into his purse. "Permit me, at least, to acknowledge your honesty." He offered a coin. Susanna looked at it, then at him. "No, thank you." He seemed genuinely surprised. In that moment, she understood that he was accustomed to gratitude being settled more easily than respect. "I must insist," he said. "And I must refuse, sir. I found what was yours and returned it. That is the whole transaction." The wind crossed the broken aisle with a cold singing sound. Somewhere behind them, a slate slid loose and shattered in the churchyard. Mr. Vale lowered his hand slowly. Whatever else he might be, he was not offended by plain dealing. He inclined his head. "Very well, Miss Fairley. Then I am in your debt in a form less convenient to discharge." Before she could answer, Mr. Bletchem appeared at her elbow so suddenly that she almost started. His cheeks were pink with exertion, his smile too quick. "Miss Fairley," he said in a tone of easy rebuke, "you are everywhere at once this morning. Have you been assisting Mr. Vale with parish business?" And then his little eyes dropped to the surveyor's coat pocket, exactly where the ring had disappeared. Mr. Vale answered before Susanna could. "Miss Fairley has been of assistance to me, sir, and I am obliged to her." It was a simple sentence, perfectly civil, yet Bletchem did not appear pleased by it. His smile stayed in place, but only as a signboard stays in the wind when the post is already splitting. He gave a little laugh and brushed damp dust from his sleeve. "Our dear Miss Fairley is of assistance to everyone," he said, "especially where accounts are concerned. I sometimes think she keeps books in her sleep." There it was again, the parish jest dressed in velvet. A few men nearby smiled because they did not know what else to do. Susanna felt the familiar sting, small enough to be deniable, sharp enough to lodge. "I sleep very soundly, Mr. Bletchem," she said. Mr. Vale glanced at her then, just once. The look was brief, but she had the odd sense that he understood far more than the words themselves. Bletchem cleared his throat and turned to business with a haste that almost betrayed him. "You will require the old repair accounts, no doubt, the church relief fund subscriptions as well. Everything is in order, of course, though the storm has left matters in some disorder." He caught himself, smiled again. "Temporarily." "I should like to see the accounts," said Mr. Vale, "from the last 3 years, including any disbursements for roof maintenance, masonry, glazing, and bell frame work." The churchwarden blinked. 3 years is a broad request. "A necessary one." The tone was mild. The refusal beneath it was iron. Bletchem shifted his weight. His boots scraped over broken plaster. "I fear some of the ledgers may be in storage. The vestry chest is damaged, keys misplaced. You understand how these things become confused after a storm." Susanna understood perfectly well that keys did not misplace themselves. She had managed the parish almshouse too long to believe confusion explained everything. Flour vanished because someone took it. Coal failed to arrive because someone sold it elsewhere. A page went missing because a hand removed it. Disorder had a way of being blamed for the very neatest kinds of theft. Mr. Vale closed his notebook. "Then I shall be grateful if the chest is opened before noon tomorrow." There was no raising of voice, no display, yet Bletchem colored at once. "Tomorrow may be difficult." "Tomorrow," Mr. Vale repeated, "will do very well." The churchwarden bowed himself away, but he did not go far. He stood under the broken arch, speaking in a low voice to his clerk, a narrow young man with red ears and ink on his cuffs. Twice the clerk looked toward Susanna. Once he looked toward the vestry door. She should have returned at once to her own duties. The women at the almshouse would need dry linens by evening, and old Mrs. Peart complained if her broth cooled even a little. Yet when Susanna turned to leave, Mr. Vale said quietly, Miss Fairley, she stopped. If your responsibilities permit it, he said, I should value any knowledge you may possess of parish disbursements. Local knowledge often clarifies what paper attempts to conceal. Local knowledge. Such a plain phrase, and still it landed strangely in her chest. No one had ever asked her to assist in church accounts because her mind might be useful. They asked when sums would be copied, when lists would be made fair, when figures must be fetched. This was different. I know only what is entered publicly, she said with care. Sometimes that is enough to begin. She inclined her head and made herself walk away at a measured pace. But at the church porch she glanced back and saw the red-eared clerk slipping out by the side passage with a bundle of ledgers pressed tight beneath his arm. She saw it only for a second, but a second was enough when one had spent years noticing what other people misplaced. The bundle under the clerk's arm was wrapped in old sacking, tied with blue wool cord from the vestry cupboard. Susanna knew that cord because she herself had sorted it by length last winter when thrift had required even string to be counted. The young man kept his head down and moved quickly along the side path toward the little gate behind the yew hedge. She might have called out. She did not. By the time she reached the porch steps, he had disappeared beyond the broken wall, and propriety, which arrives so promptly when one most resents it, informed her that a vicar's daughter ought not to go hurrying after parish clerks through a wet burial ground. Susanna stood still, her fingers cold against the stone rail, and felt the familiar annoyance of being expected to behave as though good breeding were a substitute for action. She went home by the path that skirted the graves and descended to the row of cottages belonging to the parish almshouse. Damp wool, boiled turnips, and wood smoke met her at the door. Within those narrow rooms, no one cared whether she had spoken too directly to a surveyor. Old Mrs. Peart wanted her broth salted. Widow Green had lost a button from her only decent gown. Mr. Hemsley swore his coal scuttle had been short by 2 shovels, though he always swore that on Mondays. There was comfort in such exact complaints. They were honest, at least. By afternoon she sat in her office with the ledger open, the pages faintly rough beneath her fingertips. Outside, rainwater dripped from the eaves into the yard in a steady ticking sound. Susanna tried to fix her mind on oatmeal, lamp oil, and blanket mending, but the image would not leave her. Blue cord, red ears, hurried steps. At last she took down last quarter's parish subscription list from the shelf where her father had asked her to keep a fair copy. The church books belonged to the church warden, but sums promised to the poor often crossed her desk in some form before they crossed anyone else's conscience. She turned page after page, scanning names and amounts. There were gifts marked for roof repair, gifts marked for widow relief. One substantial donation had been entered twice in 2 different hands, once under the church account, once under relief. That might have been error. It might have been nothing at all. And yet she remembered Mr. Bletcham's face when Mr. Vale asked for 3 years of accounts. Just before dusk, there came a discreet knock at the office door. Anna Reed, the seamstress who sometimes helped mend linens for the old women, slipped inside with rain on her bonnet and unease in her eyes. "Miss Fairley," she whispered, "I thought you ought to know. I saw Mr. Bletcham's clerk feeding loose papers into the wash-house fire." Anna spoke so low that the fire itself seemed louder than she was. Susanna set down her pen. "Are you certain?" "I was hanging the last of Mrs. Green's sheets in the lean-to," the girl whispered. Her cheeks were pink from the damp, and loose wisps of hair clung to her temples. "I smell paper first. It has a sharp sort of smell when it burns, drier than wood. Then I looked through the boards and saw him poking at the ashes with the laundry stick." He kept glancing over his shoulder. Susanna believed her at once. Anna Reed was not given to invention. She stitched neatly, spoke rarely, and blushed whenever addressed by anyone of consequence. If she had come in at dusk, wet shoes and all, to report such a thing, than she had first argued with herself for a quarter of an hour.
"Did he see you?" "No, miss. I ran round the far side."
Susanna rose, took her shawl from the chair, and tied it more firmly beneath her chin. The office still held the day's closeness of ink, wool, and cooling broth, but beyond the door the evening had sharpened. The yardstones were slick. Water dripped from the pump handle. Somewhere in the row, an old woman coughed behind a wall as thin as honesty. "If there is anything left in the grate," Susanna said, "we must look now." Anna's eyes widened. "Ought we not tell your father?" "My father would first consider whether it were proper to interfere. By then the ashes would be cold and turned over." It was not unkindness that made her say it. The vicar was a gentle man. He preferred souls to sums, prayers to disputes, and he had spent so many years smoothing quarrels in the parish that he had almost forgotten some quarrels ought to be faced before they spread. Susanna loved him for his tenderness and despaired of it in equal measure. They crossed the yard with the hems of their gowns darkening in the damp. The wash-house stood apart from the cottages, a low brick place with a warped door and a smell of soap, wet charcoal, and steam sunk into the walls. Inside, the fire in the copper furnace had burned low. Gray ash lay thick in the mouth of the grate, but there were still black-edged curls among it, and one corner of a paper had escaped the worst. Susanna knelt without ceremony. Heat touched her face. She took the laundry tongs from the wall and drew the fragment free. The edge crumbled, leaving soot on her fingers, but a few lines remained. A sum. A date. And beneath them, in a broad, clerkly hand, the words "Bell Timber, paid in full." Paid in full. Her breath caught. The bell frame had not been repaired at all. Anna bent beside her. "Miss." "Yes," Susanna said quietly. "Yes, I see it." Then from outside came the crunch of a boot on wet gravel, followed by the unmistakable sound of the wash-house latch being tried from the other side. For one suspended moment, neither she nor Anna moved. The latch lifted again with a dry metal scrape. Susanna folded the half-burned paper into her palm so quickly that ash streaked her glove. Then she rose and crossed to the door before fear could make a coward of either of them. When she opened it, cold evening air pressed in at once, carrying the smell of wet brick and wood smoke. Mr. Vale stood on the threshold. Anna let out the breath she had been holding so sharply it was almost a gasp. The surveyor's gaze went first to her face, then to Susanna's soot-marked fingers, then past them to the dying furnace. He took in the whole scene with that same exact stillness she had noticed in the church. No wasted movement, no wasted question. "I beg your pardon," he said. "Your maid told me Miss Fairley had come this way in haste." "Anna is no maid of mine," Susanna answered, though gently. "She assists with mending." Then, because the thing in her hand seemed to throb with urgency, she held out the scorched scrap. "This was in the fire." He stepped inside and shut the door behind him. The wash-house felt very small then, close with damp steam trapped in the walls. Mr. Vale opened the paper carefully. His eyes sharpened as he read the surviving lines. "Bell timber, paid in full," he said. "It was never done," Susanna replied. "Everyone in the parish knows it was not done." "Yes." His gaze went to the ash bed. "And someone wished this forgotten." He did not touch the grate himself. Instead, he removed a clean handkerchief from his coat, spread it across the wash bench, and began laying out what fragments he could salvage with the tongs. The action was so practical, so unadorned, that Susanna felt some inward knot ease despite herself. Here was no gentleman recoiling from soot, no superior mind dismissing domestic evidence because it came from a laundry furnace. He worked as though every blackened scrap mattered. Anna, encouraged, knelt opposite him. "There may be more beneath," she whispered.
There may, he said, and if there are, we shall keep them. We. The word should have meant very little, yet Susanna heard it. When at last he straightened, he wrapped the fragments with surprising neatness and turned to her. Miss Fairley, I must ask a favor of you. You may ask it. I should like to see the copies you keep of subscriptions and relief disbursements, especially any entries touching the church roof, the bells, or the poor boxes. Quietly, if you please. She hesitated only because the request pierced directly through the wall she had spent years building between usefulness and importance. Her books were always wanted for drudgery, never for judgment. You think the accounts may answer this? I think, he said, and there was a grave warmth in his voice now, that whoever mocked you for loving ledgers may yet regret giving such a gift a name. Then from the yard outside came Mr. Bletcham's voice calling her father by name and asking whether Miss Fairley was within. Mr. Vale's expression did not alter, but he moved at once. He took the packet of charred fragments from the wash-bench, slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat, and with the other hand drew the door wide as if there had never been secrecy in the room at all. Mr. Bletcham stood in the yard with the vicar a pace behind him, the churchwarden's hat darkened by mist, and his mouth arranged in injured concern. Ah, he said, peering past Vale into the wash-house. I feared Miss Fairley might be overtaxing herself. These parish exertions are apt to give delicate ladies a taste for matters best left to men of business. Susanna felt the words like grit between the teeth. Delicate ladies. If she had been delicate, half the old women in the row would have gone without broth last winter. If she had been delicate, no one's accounts would ever have balanced. Yet she knew that answering too warmly would only feed the picture he wished to paint. My daughter was seeing to the laundry fire, said her father, with mild uncertainty. Mr. Vale inclined his head. Miss Fairley has also been kind enough to answer a few questions touching local subscriptions, and knowledge is exact. It was an elegant defense, and because it was given without flourish, Bletcham could not openly challenge it. He only smiled again, though the smile sat poorly now. Indeed. I had not known the parish records extended to the almshouse. They extend wherever the parish poor are told relief has been sent, Susanna said. The silence that followed was brief, but full. Her father looked faintly troubled. Anna dropped her gaze to the wet stones, and Mr. Bletcham's eyes hardened with a little flash he could not smooth away quickly enough. Miss Fairley, he said, precision is an admirable habit. Suspicion is less feminine. Before she could reply, Mr. Vale spoke in the same measured tone. Suspicion has no sex, Mr. Bletcham. It usually follows irregularities. The churchwarden turned to him at once. Irregularities? Surely you do not suggest. I suggest nothing tonight. I request only that the vestry chest, the subscription ledgers, and the vouchers concerning bell timber be produced by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. The word vouchers struck like a tap to glass, small, almost nothing, unless one was already cracked. Bletcham's fingers tightened on his cane. The hour is inconvenient. Then inconvenience must be borne. Susanna should have been frightened by the calm with which he said it. Instead, she felt a surprising steadiness enter her, as if his composure had lent structure to her own. Mr. Vale gave the vicar a formal bow, then to her a slighter one, private in feeling if not in show. Miss Fairley, he said, if it is not too troublesome, might I call tomorrow at the parish almshouse to review your copies before attending the church? Bletcham heard that request as clearly as she did. She saw it in the quick rise of his chest, the tiny shift of his jaw. And then, far across the dark churchyard, a pane of broken vestry glass gave back a glimmer of lantern light, moving inside where no one ought to have been at all. All four of them turned at once. From where they stood, the broken vestry window showed only a smear of yellow through jagged glass, wavering as a lantern moved across the inner wall. The church ought to have been empty. The workmen had gone home. The sexton had locked the south door before dusk. Even Mr. Bletcham went still for a beat, though he recovered quickly enough to feign annoyance. "There," he said too briskly. "You see what comes of storm damage? Any idle fellow may creep in where the parish is left exposed." Mr. Vale said nothing.
He was already watching the light, his face sharpened by attention. Susanna noticed then that he did not glance at Bletcham for instruction or even agreement. He judged for himself. There was something in that quiet habit of authority which did not suit his plain coat nearly as well as it ought. Her father looked distressed. "Surely someone should see to it." "I shall," said Mr. Vale. Bletcham lifted a hand. "My dear sir, in the dark? It is hardly proper to drag ladies through a ruined church at this hour. We may look to it in the morning." "The light is there now," Susanna said before she could stop herself. The churchwarden gave her a look full of weary forbearance, the sort meant to make a sensible woman doubt her own senses. "Miss Fairley, zeal is admirable. Prudence is better." Mr. Vale's gaze flicked to her, and again she had that odd impression that he heard not only the words spoken, but those buried beneath them. "Miss Fairley is correct," he said. "If papers are being removed, mourning will be of little service." The last word had barely left him when the lantern inside vanished. A cold little thread ran down Susanna's spine. The churchyard seemed suddenly larger, the leaning stones whiter in the dusk, the bare yews darker. Water dripped somewhere near the lich gate with a patient tick, tick, tick. Her father murmured something about fetching a man. Bletcham began to object. Mr. Vale was already striding toward the path. Susanna did not think. She followed. The grass soaked the hem of her gown at once. Behind her came Anna's soft gasp, and then the churchwarden's exasperated call, but she kept on. By the time she reached the shattered porch, Mr. Vale had found a hand lantern hanging where the masons had left it. He lit it from the taper by the door and turned as she approached. "You ought not to be here," he said quietly. "So I am told with some regularity." For the briefest instant, something like reluctant amusement touched his mouth. Then it was gone. "Very well, stay behind me." He pushed the warped vestry door inward. Damp stone breathed out. So did the smell of extinguished oil. The room was in disorder already from the storm, yet even Susanna could see at once that this was fresh disturbance. Broken plaster had been kicked aside. One drawer of the old chest hung crooked. On the floor beneath the window lay a scatter of papers, a snapped bit of sealing wax, and one glove. Fine kid leather, far too good for the clerk. Mr. Vale bent, picked it up, and turned it over in the lantern light. Then he looked toward the dark opening beyond the vestry passage, where the church interior lay black and hollow, and said in a changed voice, low and very controlled, "We are no longer dealing with a frightened subordinate." His words settled over the vestry like dust after a blow. Mr. Bletcham had followed them to the door by then, puffing slightly from the damp cold and from indignation. "Really, sir," he said, "you make a drama of a glove. One of the masons may have dropped it days ago." Mr. Vale turned the thing once more in the lantern light. The leather was pale and supple, the stitching fine enough that even Susanna, who had no taste for fashion, could see it had not come from any village shop. There was a faint scent on it, too, not lime, not rain, but some clean, sharp oil, like orange peel and cedar laid away in a gentleman's dressing case. "No mason in this parish works stone in kid gloves," he said. Bletcham's mouth thinned. Her father, poor man, stood between alarm and embarrassment, wishing the whole matter into smaller proportions. Susanna knew the look.
He had worn it whenever church quarrels threatened to become human ones. Yet the church itself, half broken around them, refused gentility. Cold air came through the shattered panes. Water darkened the old wood chest. The place smelled of wet mortar and secrets dragged into the open. Mr. Vale lifted the lantern and went down the narrow vestry passage into the nave. Susanna followed, despite the church warden's soft protest. Their steps sounded hollow between the pews. The church in darkness was a stranger to itself. Torn canvas lay over one aisle. The broken west window let in a chalky smear of moonlight. Somewhere above, loosened metal gave a faint, complaining tick in the bell frame. At the rail near the south transept, Vale stopped. "There," he said. A page had caught on a splintered edge of the screen, half hidden where a hasty hand had thrust it and missed. Susanna drew it free. The paper was rougher than her own copies, stained at one corner, but the ink remained plain enough. It was not a bill this time. It was a list of names and sums collected for roof repair the previous Michaelmas. 2 amounts had been crossed through and written again in another hand, larger by several pounds each. Bletchem came nearer. "Old revisions, perfectly ordinary." "Then why remove the page?" Susanna asked. He looked at her as if she had spoken out of turn in drawing-room company. "My dear Miss Fairley, every parish paper in a storm-damaged church is in peril. You mistake confusion for design." Mr. Vale said nothing at first. He held the page beside the charred scrap from the wash-house, comparing ink, spacing, clerk's hand, and the broad looping capitals with the attention of a solicitor studying a will. Then he folded both papers together and placed them carefully away. "Tomorrow," he said, "I shall require the full account books, the voucher box, and the key to the subscription chest. If any one of those is missing, I shall send directly to the bishop's chancellor." At that, even Bletchem lost color. And Susanna, glancing down as the lantern shifted, saw something glint at the foot of the reading desk. A broken sliver of red sealing wax, stamped with the same device she had once seen cut into the ring. She stooped before anyone else could stop her and picked up the fragment of wax between finger and thumb. It was no bigger than a clipped nail, still hard, still red, with part of an impression sunk into it. The lantern shook slightly in Mr. Vale's hand as he watched her turn it toward the light. Susanna could make out only a curve, a deep cut like the edge of a crest, and one sharp line that might have been a leaf or a crown point. What she knew with certainty was simpler than heraldry. It matched the seal she had noticed cut into the ring she had returned. Mr. Bletchem held out his hand at once. "Allow me, Miss Fairley. Loose rubbish from the floor proves nothing." She did not give it to him. "I believe," she said, and was startled by how steady her own voice sounded, "that if it proves nothing, it will keep just as well in Mr. Vale's care." The churchwarden's face tightened. Her father, who heard the strain now, if not the cause, said gently, "Susanna, my dear." But Vale had already extended his gloved palm. She laid the wax upon it. He closed his fingers around the bit of red as carefully as he had once closed them around the ring. Something passed over his expression then. Not surprise exactly, but recognition mixed with displeasure of a very private sort. "You have seen this device before?" she asked, before caution could catch up with her. He looked at her for a long second. Yes, that was all. Bletchem recovered his voice first. "A seal proves correspondence, nothing more. Papers are sealed every day. If some gentleman's agent has been in and out of the vestry on repair business, such scraps may be anywhere." "A gentleman's agent," Mr. Vale repeated. The words were polite, yet they seemed to lower the air in the room. Susanna felt, rather than understood, that the churchwarden had put his foot on uncertain ground. Vale slipped the wax fragment into the same inner pocket that held the glove and the scorched papers. "I shall make a memorandum of where it was found." It is absurd to make a criminal history of church dust, Bletchem said sharply now.
You were sent here to survey stone and timber, sir, not to harry parish officers with insinuation. I was sent here, Vale answered, to discover what the storm damaged and what was damaged before the storm ever touched it. After that, there was little more to be said in the church. Her father urged everyone home. Bletchem bowed himself away with wounded dignity, though he kept glancing once at Vale and twice at Susanna, as if recalculating both. Outside, the air had turned colder. A pale mist hovered low among the graves. Anna had long since run back to the cottages, and the yard beyond the porch glimmered with puddles. Mr. Vale walked with Susanna as far as the gate to the vicarage path. Neither spoke for several moments. Then he said, quietly, "Miss Fairley, tomorrow I must ask more of you than I had intended." She drew her shawl close. "If it concerns my books, you may have them." "I feared you would say so." There was weariness in the words, and something else beneath it. Before she could name it, hoofbeats sounded from the lane beyond the yews, quick and official. A rider reined in at the gate, carrying a lantern and a packet sealed in black. "For Mr. Vale," he called. "By express order." The rider waited in the lane with his horse blowing steam into the mist, while Mr. Vale broke the seal beneath the lantern. Susanna saw very little and yet too much. The paper was thick. The hand on the outside was formal. The wax, dark against the fold, bore an impression too clean to belong to any village office. Vale read swiftly, once only, then folded the letter again with a care that suggested discipline rather than calm. Something in his face shut at once, inward, as a door is closed when weather turns. "My apologies," he said to her father. "I am required early tomorrow." The rider touched his hat and withdrew a pace, clearly waiting for some answer to carry back. Mr. Bletchem, who had not yet gone home after all, stood half in shadow near the yews and pretended not to listen. Susanna could feel the whole little scene arranging itself around silence and rank, though nobody had spoken either word aloud. Her father, poor gentleman, attempted civility. "Nothing amiss, I trust?" "Nothing that alters the morning's business," said Vale. Then he turned to Susanna. "If Miss Fairley remains willing, I shall call at the parish almshouse at 9 o'clock. "I shall be there," she said. He bowed, yet she had the oddest impression that he wished to say something else and did not. He mounted the waiting horse instead of the one he had brought earlier, which told her more than words might have done. Men did not exchange horses for ordinary messages, not at that hour, not with an express rider. By the time she and her father reached the vicarage, the kitchen fire had burned low, and the house smelled of toasted bread, damp wool, and the lavender Mrs. Finch insisted on keeping in the press, though the scent never survived winter. Her father spoke little. He was troubled, and when troubled he grew mild to the point of uselessness. At last, as he set down his hat upon the hall table, he said, "My dear, I hope you are not too deeply entangled in this unhappy matter." Susanna untied her bonnet strings with fingers still cold from the churchyard. "If the matter touches the church accounts and the poor boxes, then I fear it has been entangled with all of us for some time." He sighed at that and kissed her forehead as he had done when she was 10 and furious over a broken slate pencil. "Only take care. Villages are never so cruel as when they suspect themselves observed." She knew it already. Sleep came badly. The wind had risen again and moved around the corners of the vicarage with a restless hush. In her room, the little fire settled now and then with a soft collapse. Susanna lay awake, thinking of scorched paper, of the bit of red wax, of Mr. Vale's face when he read the express letter. He was no ordinary surveyor. That much had become impossible to deny. Yet if he were some person of consequence, why choose plain clothes, long walks, and parish dust? Why keep his name tucked away as carefully as that sealed packet in his coat?
Morning arrived, gray and sharp. She went early to her office at the almshouse, unlocked the drawer where she kept her fare copies, and laid out the ledgers one by one upon the table. Flower subscriptions, coal allowances, repair donations noted when parish promises crossed into poor relief. The pages smelled of ink and starch and old paper warmed by the room. At the very bottom of the stack, where she had not looked in months, she found a folded memorandum in another hand entirely, and at the foot of it, pressed faintly into the paper, was the same seal she had seen in wax the night before. For a moment she only stared at the faint impression in the paper, as if looking harder might teach her to read a crest. The memorandum was brief, written in a hand she did not know. It referred to an earlier estimate for repairs at the church, and beneath the last line, where no name was plainly written, the seal had bitten lightly through the fold. Time had paled it, but not enough to hide the shape. It was the same device she had seen in wax on the church floor, the same device she had glimpsed cut into the ring she had returned without a second thought. Susanna sat down very slowly. The office at the parish almshouse was hardly grand enough for revelations. The grate needed sweeping. A draught came under the door and worried the hem of an old shawl hanging by the peg. The room smelled of ink, starch, and the faint medicinal sharpness of camphor from the cupboard where she kept salves for the widows. Yet it seemed all at once that she was holding some thread tied to a much larger world, one of estates, solicitors, and decisions made far from village kitchens. Why had such a paper ever come into her keeping? She searched her memory and found it at last. The memorandum had arrived months ago, folded among general parish instructions, when the former steward at a neighboring estate had written regarding small charitable disbursements after a hard winter. She had copied the sums that mattered to the poor and put the rest aside. At the time, the seal had meant nothing to her. Now it felt like a hand from the dark tapping her shoulder and saying, "Look again." A knock sounded at the outer door. She started, folded the paper, and rose. Mr. Vale stood there in the gray morning, one glove in his hand, the damp of the lane still on his boots. He looked as though he had been awake for hours. The express letter of the night before had left its mark. There was no disarray in him, no visible fatigue one might politely remark upon, but something in his face had drawn tighter, as if whatever burden he carried had shifted closer to bone. "You are early, sir," she said. "I feared delay." He entered at her invitation and removed his hat. His gaze went at once to the ledgers laid open on the table, then to the folded memorandum still resting near her hand. He missed very little. Susanna had known that from the beginning. Still, she felt suddenly and absurdly as though she had been caught in some impropriety merely by noticing too much. "I found something among my copies," she said. He did not reach for it. "Something useful?" "I do not know," she hesitated. "Something sealed." That was the word that changed him, only slightly. A stillness, then a carefulness even stricter than before. "May I see it?" She handed it over. He unfolded the memorandum and read. When his eyes fell to the impression at the foot, his hand closed once on the page, just holding it harder than before. Then he lifted his gaze to hers. And in that silence, before he said a word, Susanna knew that whatever name he had given her, it was not the whole of him. He answered her look with caution, and that caution told her almost as much as any confession might have done. "This paper," he said at last, "passed once through an estate office that had reason to concern itself with the parish fabric. It should not have been among your private copies." "That is not the same thing as saying how it came there." "No." His voice was gentle but firm. "It is not." For one breath, perhaps two, Susanna considered pressing him harder. She had earned that much. She had found the ring, the wax, the burned paper. She had stood in cold churches and smoky wash-houses while gentlemen measured their words. Yet something in his face checked her. It was strain held under rule, the look of a man who had been taught from youth that feeling was to be governed before it governed him. So she said only, "Then let us begin with what can be proved." If he was surprised by her mercy, he hid it quickly. He drew a chair to the table, removed his gloves, and bent over the ledgers. His hands were strong, well kept, and marked faintly with ink at the side of one finger. Not a laborer's hands, not an idle man's either. Susanna sat opposite, opened her copies, and the little office filled with the dry whisper of turning pages. For the first half-hour they spoke almost entirely in figures: coal allotments, roofing subscriptions, timber allowances, sums promised in church and sums that reached the poor by smaller, stranger roads. He asked exact questions, never wasting one. She answered from memory when she could, from entries when she must. Before long they had built between them a quiet rhythm so natural that she forgot to be self-conscious in it. "You note the donor twice here," he said, tapping one line. "Because he gave twice," she answered. "Once publicly for the roof, once privately for widow relief. Mr. Bletcham announced only the first." Vale looked up. "You remember that?" "I remember every gift that arrived with conditions attached to another woman's hunger." Something changed in his expression then. Warmth, perhaps, or admiration so restrained it scarcely dared become visible. "Miss Fairley," he said softly, "you keep books as other people keep conscience." The words touched her more than they should have done. She lowered her eyes to the page because she did not know where else to put them. By 11 o'clock, the evidence had begun to gather shape. A repair allowance listed as spent before materials were delivered. A glazier's fee entered in winter for work plainly not done until spring. And then, midway down a copied voucher list, Susanna's fingers stopped. "This name," she said. Vale leaned nearer. "Mr. Jonah Pike, stonemason, paid in full." "Yes?" She looked at him. "Mr. Pike has been dead these 3 years." The office fell very still. Outside, a cart rolled past on the lane, wheels grating over stones. From the next room came the faint clink of crockery as Anna set broth to warm for the oldest women. Ordinary sounds, ordinary morning, and yet the air between them had sharpened completely. Vale reached for a fresh sheet of paper. "We shall need sworn confirmation of that." Before Susanna could answer, the outer passage filled with heavier steps, confident and public. Then Mr. Bletcham's voice rang through the open door for all the almshouse to hear. "Miss Fairley, I am told you have chosen to turn your charitable office into an auditor's chamber." The words were loud enough to carry beyond the office and into the passage where the old women liked to listen without appearing to listen. Susanna rose before Mr. Vale could. She would not have it said, later and with relish, that a gentleman had hidden her behind his shoulder in her own room. Mr. Bletcham filled the doorway with injured authority, hat in hand, gloves tucked beneath one arm, his expression arranged to suggest regret at finding impropriety where he had feared only overzealous housekeeping. "What is this?" he asked, looking from the ledgers to Vale, then to the memoranda laid between them. "Am I to understand that parish records are being examined in private, without the presence of the proper church officers?" The office seemed to contract around the question. The little grate hissed faintly. Somewhere deeper in the almshouse a spoon struck a basin. Susanna could almost feel the widows holding their breath through the walls. "These are Miss Fairley's own copies," said Vale. "Copies may mislead," Bletcham replied smoothly. "Detached from their original context, any line item may be made to appear suspicious, particularly in hands untrained to ecclesiastical business." That last was for her. Of course it was. He would not accuse outright while witnesses were absent. He would diminish. It was safer, more respectable.
Susanna rested her fingertips on the open page before her. If by untrained you mean I have not misplaced 3 years of repair vouchers, then yes, I must plead ignorance. Bletcham's eyes flashed. The civility on his face stayed, but only just. My dear Miss Fairley, I have long admired your diligence. Yet a woman who spends her life with accounts may begin to imagine that all wisdom lies in columns. And a man who spends his life hiding among columns, said Vale quietly, may begin to imagine they do not speak. The silence after that was sharper than any raised voice. Bletcham turned to him at once. Sir, I will not be addressed as though I were already accused. Then produce the original books, said Vale, and the vouchers, and the key to the subscription chest. The churchwarden drew himself up. I came here, in point of fact, to inform Miss Fairley that her continued interference has already given rise to unfortunate talk. People are asking whether almshouse monies and church subscriptions have been too freely compared, whether charitable zeal has encouraged confusion. There it was, insult with design. Susanna felt the heat rise in her face, then drain away again. He meant to place a shadow over her before the truth had time to stand upright. If the parish could be led to doubt her books, then every widow fed from them, every candle bought, every loaf stretched, might become part of his defense. Vale's expression changed very little, but something cold entered it. You choose an imprudent line, Mr. Bletcham. I choose, said the churchwarden, to protect the parish from scandal. No, Susanna said, and heard the steadiness in her own voice. You choose to put my name in front of your fear. Bletcham looked at her with open displeasure now. Take care, Miss Fairley. Good name is a fragile thing. So is false credit, she answered. For one instant she thought he might say something harsher. Instead, he smiled again, that dreadful smile of a man who believes malice sounds holier when spoken softly. Very well, he said. If scrutiny is the order of the day, let us have it publicly. I have asked 2 parish ladies and the curate to attend at the schoolroom this afternoon, that no one may later claim secrecy. He paused, glanced at Vale, and added with calculated sweetness, And perhaps, sir, before you sit in judgment, you will explain to the parish by what exact authority you do so? The challenge hung in the room like smoke after a candle is snuffed. Mr. Vale did not answer at once. He merely looked at Bletcham with a composure so complete that the churchwarden's little display of triumph began, almost imperceptibly, to sour in his own hand. Susanna watched them both and understood that the question had been laid like a trap. If Vale named too much, he exposed whatever private purpose had brought him here in plain dress. If he named too little, Bletcham would call him an intruder before the parish. At present, Vale said at last, my authority is sufficient. It was an infuriating reply, deliberately so. Bletcham gave a thin laugh. To yourself, perhaps. I think the parish may require a clearer warrant. The parish, said Susanna before she could stop herself, might first require clearer accounts. Her words won her a sharp glance from both men, though for very different reasons. From Bletcham, resentment. From Vale, something nearer concern. She knew at once what he feared, that she had stepped farther into public fire than even truth might yet shield. The churchwarden bowed slightly, all civility restored on the surface. Then let us meet in the schoolroom at 2 o'clock. I shall bring what papers I can collect. You, Mr. Vale, may bring your authority, and Miss Fairley may bring whatever copies she believes fit to parade. When he was gone, the office seemed to exhale. The old boards settled. Somewhere down the passage, one of the widows muttered that broth was getting cold, which would have been comic had Susanna's pulse not been beating so hard at her throat. She turned to Vale.
You cannot mean to let him gather the room for his own theater. I mean to let him believe it is his. He began sorting the papers with swift, exact hands, separating her copies from the notes he had made. The coolness of his manner should have steadied her. Instead, it sharpened the unease that had been growing since the sealed memorandum and the express rider. There were too many doors in this man, and every one shut neatly. "You still will not tell me?" she asked. His hands paused, only that. "Miss Fairley, if I am to stand there under every eye in the parish while he implies that I have meddled beyond my place, then I think I have some claim to plain speaking." She had not raised her voice. The hurt in it surprised her more than it did him. For one raw second she wished the words back. They sounded too near reproach, and she had no right to reproach a man whose business was not hers. But he did not take offense. He looked at her with a gravity that made the small room feel oddly still. "You have every claim," he said, "more than I have honored. I ask for a few hours more, not to preserve myself, but to prevent him from shifting the ground under us before the papers are secured." Us. There it was again, and more dangerous now because it came with honesty. Susanna looked down at the ledgers, at her own thin, ink-marked fingers resting on the margin. "Very well," she said. "A few hours?" He gave the slightest nod, almost weary in its gratitude. Then he drew from his coat a folded note, sealed already for dispatch. "I must send this to the bishop's chancellor before noon," he said. "If Bletchem withholds a single original voucher, matters will move beyond parish courtesy." She stared. "You had already written it?" "Before he arrived." That answer told her how far ahead he was thinking, and how grave the matter had become. Then Anna appeared breathless at the office door. "Miss Fairley," she said, eyes wide, "Mrs. Locksley and Mrs. Canterby are in the front passage already, and they are asking whether it is true you have been keeping 2 sets of church books." The blow had fallen faster than even Susanna feared it might. Mrs. Locksley and Mrs. Canterby stood in the front passage in respectable bonnets and righteous curiosity, both carrying the faint outdoor smell of damp wool and cold air. They had not come for broth or linens. They had come to see whether scandal looked different when placed among old ledgers and medicine jars. Susanna stepped out before either woman could peer around her shoulder into the office. "Good morning." "My dear Miss Fairley," said Mrs. Locksley, whose voice always sounded as though she were praising someone across a sickbed. "We were distressed to hear that questions had arisen." "Questions about figures," added Mrs. Canterby, with the eager sorrow of one who enjoys grief best when it belongs to another. "One hardly knows what to believe." That was the cruelty of it. No accusation stated plainly, only concern. Concern was the cleanest glove gossip ever wore. Behind Susanna she could feel rather than see Vale gathering the papers, protecting them. She was absurdly grateful for the distinction. "There is no need for distress," she said. "Mr. Bletchem has called a meeting for the afternoon, and I have no objection to any proper review." Mrs. Locksley gave a little blink. She had expected defensiveness, perhaps tears. Quiet composure disappointed people like her. "Still," she murmured, "a lady's name is delicate." Susanna looked at her steadily. "Then it ought not be handled by idle fingers." For once, neither woman answered at once. They went away soon after, though not before carrying with them exactly the one thing Susanna had hoped to deny them, the certainty that something was indeed amiss. When the outer door shut, the silence left behind was almost worse than their voices. She returned to the office and found Mr. Vale sealing the note to the bishop's chancellor with quick, sure pressure. He had used no crest that she could see, only plain wax from her own box. Yet there was still that impression about him, that he had spent his whole life moving in rooms where letters altered lives. "It has begun then," she said. "Yes." He did not offer comfort at once, and oddly, that was its own comfort. He respected the seriousness of it too much for easy phrases. Instead, he handed her the copied list naming Jonah Pike, the dead mason, and marked 3 further entries beneath it. These we must establish before the meeting, if we can. Mrs. Pike still lives in the lower lane? She does? Will she speak to you? Susanna thought of the widow's poor eyesight, her stiff hands, the careful pride with which she still scrubbed her doorstep. To me, yes. To a room full of parish officers? Perhaps not. Then we go to her now. We again. Simple, dangerous word. They took cloaks and stepped into the noon wind. The village had already changed around her. A boy outside the smithy stopped staring only when his mother called him in. The baker's wife, who had always greeted Susanna warmly enough, gave a little nod and then turned to whisper to the woman beside her. Above them, the church tower stood raw against the gray sky, its broken stone catching pale light like bone. Halfway down the lane, Vale slowed. "You must know this," he said, not looking at her. "By evening, your good name may stand on no firmer ground than mine." Susanna turned to him. "Then perhaps, sir, it is time I knew what ground yours stands on." Before he could answer, the door of Widow Pike's cottage opened, and Mr. Bletcham himself stepped out onto the path. He stopped short when he saw them, and for a single clean instant his face forgot how to lie. It was there and gone at once. Surprise, annoyance, calculation. Then Mr. Bletcham recovered his public manner and placed his hat more squarely upon his head, as if a firmer brim might steady the situation. "Miss Fairley," he said. "Mr. Vale." "I had not expected you in this quarter." "That much is plain," said Vale. The widow's cottage stood crouched against the wind, its thatch patched, its little front plot swept bare. Smoke came weakly from the chimney. Susanna could smell damp earth, cabbage water, and the bitter tang of cheap coal. She thought suddenly of the entry in her copybook, Jonah Pike paid in full, and felt a flare of anger so sharp it almost warmed her. "You are acquainted with Mrs. Pike this morning?" she asked. Bletcham spread his hands. "I call, as I often do, upon the deserving poor. It is one of the weary privileges of parish office." Vale's eyes rested on him with that same unreadable calm. "And was your call prompted by charity, or by the discovery that a dead mason has been receiving wages in the books?" The churchwarden's mouth tightened. "This is intolerable." "It may yet become inconvenient," said Vale. Bletcham turned to Susanna then, abandoning dignity for persuasion. "Miss Fairley, I entreat you to consider what sort of man encourages you to stand in lanes and put questions fit for solicitors. Your position here is delicate enough already." Her position. Always that. As though womanhood were a cracked cup everyone expected her to carry without spilling shame upon the stones. "My position," she said, "is that of a woman asking why Widow Pike's husband appears richer in death than he ever was in life." Before Bletcham could answer, the cottage door opened wider behind him, and a thin old voice called, "If it is Miss Fairley, let her in. I'm not deaf, only old." Widow Pike stood inside with a shawl pinned tightly over her shoulders and flower on one hand. Her eyes were clouded with age, but not with foolishness. She looked from one face to the next and gave a little huff of impatience. "Best come out of the wind if you mean to quarrel on Christian ground," she said. They entered. The room was low-ceilinged and close with the smell of broth, peat smoke, and damp wool drying too near the grate. Bletcham remained standing, as if unwilling to take a seat in poverty unless admired for it. Susanna sat beside the widow. Vale stayed near the hearth, one hand resting on the mantel, his silence somehow more commanding than another man's speech. Mrs. Pike answered plainly when Susanna asked the question. "My Jonah?" she said. He has been in the churchyard these 3 years come Candlemas. Left me tools, 2 stools, and more debts than flour. Why? Susanna drew out the copied entry and read it aloud. The old woman's lined face altered slowly, disbelief moving into offended dignity. "Paid in full," she repeated. "No one paid Jonah for church stone after he took the fever. He never worked that job. Mr. Bletcham knows it." All eyes turned. The churchwarden gave a short laugh that failed before it had properly begun. "A clerical oversight, nothing more. Names remain in old patterns. One sees such things." Vale's voice came low. "Then you will have no objection to Mrs. Pike attesting as much before witnesses this afternoon?" Widow Pike straightened in her chair. "I will say what I know to any soul that asks." Bletcham stared at her, then at Susanna, and for the first time she saw something very like alarm settle fully into his face. Then he made his mistake. He looked straight at Mr. Vale and said, "You forget yourself, sir. This parish is not governed by nameless men carrying borrowed seals." The room went so quiet that even the fire seemed to draw in its breath. Widow Pike looked from one man to the other with sharp old eyes. Susanna felt the words strike her in 2 places at once. Borrowed seals. So Bletcham knew, or guessed, far more than he had any right to know. And Mr. Vale? Mr. Vale did not deny it. He only stood there beside the low hearth, one hand still resting on the mantel, his face suddenly harder than she had ever seen it. "You speak very confidently," he said. Bletcham gave a brittle little shrug. "When strangers arrive with private memoranda, sealed letters, and a dangerous appetite for parish confusion, confidence becomes a duty." It was a foolish thing to say before witnesses, yet fear often makes men vain of their own cleverness. Susanna saw that now. The churchwarden had grown so accustomed to steering small minds that he had begun to mistake recklessness for control. Widow Pike made an impatient sound in her throat. "If you gentlemen have done circling one another, I can tell you plain what I know. My Jonah did no bell work after the fever, and if any paper says otherwise, then paper lies." Vale bowed his head slightly to her. "Madam, would you be willing to repeat that in the schoolroom this afternoon?" "I have fewer afternoons ahead of me than behind," she said. "I don't mean to waste them helping thieves keep warm." Bletcham flushed darkly. "You use intemperate language." "I use the one that fits," she snapped. Susanna could almost have smiled if the moment had not been so sharp. Instead, she stepped nearer the widow's chair and laid a hand lightly on the old woman's shoulder. It was a simple touch, but Vale saw it. She knew he saw it because something in his expression eased for a fleeting instant, as if practical kindness still had the power to astonish him. Bletcham, finding the room turned against him, tried another path. He turned to Susanna with false sorrow. "My dear Miss Fairley, you are being employed. That is the grief of it. A gentleman without a proper introduction arrives, flatters your cleverness, encourages you to mistake management for judgment, and suddenly the whole parish must pay the price." The words burned because they touched the oldest bruise. Years of being useful, years of being smiled at and set aside, years of hearing that exactness in a woman was admirable only so long as it remained invisible. Susanna felt the wound open, and then, to her own surprise, close again. "No," she said, "you mistake me for someone who can be led by vanity. I know precisely what I am doing." Bletcham stared at her. Vale's gaze met hers then, and in it there was no mockery, no indulgence, no alarm that she had spoken too boldly. There was respect, quiet, grave, unmistakable respect. It steadied her more than any reassurance could have done. The churchwarden set his hat firmly back upon his head. "Very well. We shall see how bold everyone remains before a room full of parish eyes." He moved toward the door. At the threshold he paused and turned once more to Vale. "If you mean to unseat me, sir, you had best come armed with more than dead masons and widows' memories." When he was gone, the cottage seemed smaller and colder for the spite he left behind. Vale watched him for a moment, then drew from his coat the sealed note meant for the bishop's chancellor. "I had hoped not to send this until after the meeting," he said quietly. Susanna looked at the letter, then at him. "And now?" He broke the seal he himself had made, added 3 swift lines beneath the fold, and turned the page just enough that she could see the fresh superscription. Not to the chancellor, to the bishop himself. Susanna did not speak until they were back outside in the lane. The wind had freshened, pushing low clouds across the afternoon sky and carrying with it the smell of damp leaves, chimney smoke, and distant rain. Mr. Vale folded the bishop's letter with grave precision and slipped it into his coat. That simple movement unsettled her more than any outburst would have done. A man who can remain calm while the whole ground shifts beneath him is either very disciplined or very accustomed to peril. "You were writing above the chancellor," she said. "Yes." "That is no small thing." "No." He looked toward the church tower rising beyond the cottages. "It is no small thing that parish moneys intended for repair and relief have been handled in this fashion." He still did not answer the deeper question beneath her words, and she knew enough now to hear the refusal even when it was wrapped in courtesy. Yet he did not dismiss her either. That mattered. It mattered more than she wished. Widow Pike had promised to come to the schoolroom if her joints would allow it, and Anna had been sent to fetch her at the proper hour. So Susanna and Vale walked back together toward the village center in a silence not empty, but taut. She could feel the afternoon waiting for them. The whole parish seemed to lean toward the coming scene as people lean toward a window when they hear shouting in the street. At the gate of the schoolroom they found her father already there, pale and anxious, smoothing his cuffs with needless attention. "My dear," he said to Susanna, "I fear this has grown beyond a mere misunderstanding." "It ceased to be that some time ago," she answered gently. Inside, the room smelled of chalk, cold rush matting, wet coats, and the ghost of children's ink. Benches had been drawn up in rows. Bletcham had chosen the space well. It made a spectacle of honesty. Mrs. Locksley and Mrs. Canterby sat together at the front, with faces arranged for sorrowful impartiality. The curate hovered near the stove, uncomfortable already. 2 church laborers had come and pretended they were only there in case a chest must be moved. Half the village would have come if invited, and at the center table, laid out with just enough papers to suggest order, stood Mr. Bletcham. He greeted Vale with a bow too stiff to be sincere. He greeted Susanna with something even thinner. "Miss Fairley, I trust you have brought your copies?" "I have." "And Mr. Vale," he said, turning, "I trust you have brought the authority you declined to name this morning?" Vale removed his gloves, finger by finger. "I have brought what is necessary." The churchwarden's eyes narrowed, but before he could answer, Anna slipped in at the back, supporting Widow Pike on one arm. The old woman's bonnet sat crooked, her mouth set firm. A little murmur ran through the room. Then another figure entered behind her, the red-eared clerk, white as flour, and clutching a ledger to his chest as if it might stop a bullet. Every eye turned. Bletcham's face changed, and Susanna understood at once that someone, somewhere between cottage and schoolroom, had broken ranks. The clerk stood just inside the door, as if he had crossed a river and was not yet certain the bank would hold. His hair, always too carefully parted, lay damp against his temple. He clutched the ledger so hard his knuckles had gone white. Anna stayed a step behind him, one hand still on Widow Pike's elbow.
and Susanna saw at once from the girl's face that this had not been an accident. Someone had spoken to someone. Fear had changed sides. Mr. Bletchem recovered first. "Thomas," he said sharply, "bring that book here." The young man did not move. Every small sound in the schoolroom seemed suddenly enormous: the hiss of the stove, the creak of a bench, the scrape of Mrs. Canterby's glove against her reticule. Susanna could feel the whole room balancing on the thin edge between decorum and collapse. "Thomas," Bletchem said again, softer now, more dangerous for it, "you are making yourself ridiculous." The clerk swallowed. "Beg pardon, sir." He took one step, not toward the churchwarden, but toward Mr. Vale. That single choice ran through the room like a draught. Mrs. Locksley drew in her breath. The curate blinked twice and looked at the vicar as if hoping somebody senior would explain the scene into harmlessness. Susanna did not move at all. She had the strange, suspended feeling that one must not even shift a sleeve when truth is deciding whether to stand up. Vale accepted the ledger without flourish. "Thank you." Bletchem gave a laugh that rang false. "A parish clerk handing records to a stranger. We improve by the minute." "Not a stranger," Thomas said, still pale. "Not entirely." Bletchem turned on him so fast the boy flinched. "Mind yourself." But fear, once it has broken its first fence, sometimes keeps running. The clerk licked dry lips and spoke to the room at large, not very loudly, yet with the desperate clarity of a man who knows he may never find courage a second time. "The chest key was never lost," he said. "Mr. Bletchem had it, and the bell timber voucher was copied after Mr. Pike died. I wrote the second hand on the Michaelmas list because I was told the first figures were untidy. I burned papers in the wash-house because I was ordered to burn them." A murmur rose at once. Mrs. Canterby made a distressed sound that was perilously close to satisfaction. Widow Pike muttered, "There now," as if someone had finally admitted rain was wet. Susanna's father sat down rather suddenly on the nearest bench. Bletchem's face had gone an ugly, congested red. "This is a lie." The boy is frightened, confused. "The boy," said Vale, opening the ledger, "has just spared you the insult of being unmasked solely by arithmetic." He turned pages quickly, then laid the book open on the center table. Susanna saw at once what he meant. There, plainly enough for any honest eye, were altered sums, crossed entries, and one page cut free so roughly that a ragged edge still clung to the stitching. The curate rose halfway from his chair. "Mr. Bletchem, what is this?" The churchwarden did not answer him. He was staring at the open ledger, then at the clerk, then at Susanna with naked hatred at last, stripped of courtesy. And then, from outside in the yard, came the thunder of another horse arriving at speed, followed by a firm knock and a servant's voice asking for Mr. Vale in the bishop's name. The knock seemed to strike the whole room at once. No one moved for a moment. Mr. Bletchem stood rigid beside the table, one hand still braced on the open ledger. Thomas looked as though he might faint outright. Widow Pike muttered that if bishops had learned to arrive on horseback for village quarrels, the world was turning stranger by the hour. Then Mr. Vale said, "Come in." The door opened, admitting a gust of cold air and a man in traveling livery, rain-dark at the shoulders, carrying a leather dispatch case. He bowed first to the vicar out of church courtesy, then crossed directly to Vale with the kind of practiced respect no servant gives by accident. "Sir," he said, low but perfectly audible in that stricken silence, "I was ordered to place this in your hand without delay." He presented the case. Susanna did not look at Vale at first. She looked at the servant, at the polished boots splashed from hard riding, at the discreet braid on the coat, at the way he kept his eyes lowered, not from uncertainty, but from habit.
This was no parish messenger or common courier borrowed in haste. Whatever world had sent him was orderly, expensive, and accustomed to obedience. Vale took the case. "You have ridden from the palace?" "Yes, sir." The curate made a small sound in his throat. Mrs. Locksley's eyes widened so far they were almost comic. Bletcham, on the other hand, seemed to shrink and stiffen at once, like wet paper held too near a flame. Vale opened the case, drew out a folded paper, and read it through. Susanna watched his face and saw the same hard stillness she had seen before, but now there was something else beneath it. Decision. A line crossed inwardly and not to be uncrossed. "Well?" Bletcham demanded, too quickly. "If the bishop has objections, let them be heard plainly." Vale folded the letter once more. "The bishop will attend the reconsecration in person." A murmur swept the room. That alone would have been enough to set the village talking for a month. Bishops did not alter their routes for every damaged parish church. They did not come themselves merely to admire new mortar and scold churchwardens over missing vouchers. Susanna felt the atmosphere shift again, deeper this time. The meeting had ceased to be local. Whatever net was drawing shut had widened beyond anyone's comfort. Bletcham tried to recover ground by force of voice. "Then all the better. Let this nonsense be settled under proper authority. Until then, I protest any further insult to my office." "You may protest what you please," said Vale. "The records remain." He laid one hand on the ledger Thomas had brought. Such a simple gesture, and yet no one attempted to take it from him. Not the curate, not the vicar, certainly not Bletcham. Susanna felt suddenly very tired. The kind of tiredness that comes not from labor, but from holding one's spine straight while other people decide whether one is worth believing. She knew, with a cold and unhappy clarity, that the evidence was mounting and still her own name hung in suspense. The parish had heard accusation. It had not yet heard absolution. The servant remained where he was, awaiting orders. Vale turned to him. "You will return at once. Tell his lordship that the books are secured, a witness has spoken, and the church warden has been confronted." "Yes, sir." The man bowed again, and this time, before he straightened, he said the one word no one in that schoolroom was meant to hear so soon. "Your Grace." No one in the schoolroom seemed to remember how to breathe. Your Grace. The title did not fall loudly, yet it altered every face at once. Mrs. Locksley went white, then pink. The curate half rose and sat again. Susanna's father stared as if his own spectacles had betrayed him. Thomas looked as though he might drop to his knees from pure habit. And Mr. Bletcham. Mr. Bletcham stood as a man stands when the stair beneath him is suddenly found not to exist. Susanna did not move. She could not. In one blinding instant, the ring in the rubble, the sealed paper, the express rider, the servant's obedience, the refusal to name himself too soon, all of it joined into a single, terrible simplicity. Mr. Vale was no Mr. Vale at all. He turned to the servant with a look that would have silenced a room far grander than that schoolhouse. "You were not instructed to announce me." The man bowed deeply. "No, Your Grace." The rebuke was mild, but the damage was done. Silence spread again, broken only by the stove's hiss and the faint rattle of sleet beginning at the window panes. Susanna felt the cold in it, and the heat in her face, and something far more painful than either, a kind of inward dislocation. She had spoken to him plainly, corrected him, questioned him, trusted him, and all the while she had not known the height of the world from which he had come down into hers. At last he faced the room. "My identity," he said, "is immaterial beside the facts before you." That restored motion, if not peace. Voices rose at once, then tangled. Mrs. Canterby breathed, "The Duke of Carrow," as if reciting a prayer she had never expected to need. The curate addressed him as "Your Grace," and then lost the rest of his sentence. Susanna's father attempted an apology for every parish slight committed within the last week. Only Bletcham did not speak. He had gone beyond words for the moment into calculation, and calculation had failed him. The Duke laid his hand on the open ledger. "These records will be removed from parish custody today. The bishop will review them. Mr. Bletcham will provide every remaining key, voucher, and receipt before nightfall." That brought the churchwarden back to himself. "You cannot condemn a man by surprise and theatre." "No," said the Duke, "but you have come very close to condemning yourself by paper." He did not look at Susanna when he said it. That omission stung more sharply than public revelation might have done. He was protecting something, or preserving some order beyond her understanding. Yet she stood there under every eye in the parish, and though the fraud now lay open, her own name was not cleansed. Not yet. The whispers against Bletcham had begun. The whispers against her had not ended. As if he knew it too, the Duke's gaze found hers at last, only for a second. There was apology in it, and restraint, and a promise postponed. Then the bishop's servant stepped forward again and said, "His lordship requests that all persons concerned attend the church on Saturday for the reconsecration and for a public statement before the congregation." The days between the schoolroom and Saturday did not pass in peace. They passed in that strained, over-polite fashion by which a village punishes scandal while pretending to regret it. Mr. Bletcham's keys were surrendered. The ledgers were taken into formal custody. Thomas repeated his account before the curate and the magistrate's clerk. Widow Pike, with grim satisfaction, declared again that her dead husband had been made to work miracles only on paper. Yet even with all that, Susanna found that truth and reputation did not travel at the same speed. Some people bowed lower to her now, others bowed less. The worst were the kind ones. The women who touched her sleeve and said, "My dear, what a distressing muddle," as if muddle had smeared her name by accident. The men who suddenly admired her spirit, having spent years calling it fussiness. And everywhere, beneath every softened tone, there remained the same humiliating question. Had she known who he was? Had she attached herself to him knowingly? Had all her precision been virtue or ambition in a plain gown? She bore it because there was nothing else to do. The Duke did not vanish. That would almost have been easier. He remained in the village, lodged with formal simplicity at the old manor house, meeting solicitors, reviewing papers, speaking with the bishop's officers. Yet after the schoolroom he no longer came and went as Mr. Vale. Every servant knew him, every door opened more quickly, every word around him bent itself. Susanna saw him only once before Saturday, across the churchyard near dusk, when the repaired bell frame was being inspected by lantern light. He stopped as if to come toward her, then looked at the pair of ladies walking just ahead of her, and only bowed. The bow was correct, distant, necessary. That night she hated herself for minding it. On Saturday morning the church smelled different. Though damp stone still held memory, it smelled of beeswax, fresh rushes, cold iron from the rehung bells, and the faint sweetness of flowers placed in jars along the chancel steps. Light moved through the restored west window in broken color. The village had come in force, best coats, best bonnets, best faces. Susanna entered with her father and felt every eye slide toward her and away again. She wore her plainest good gown. There had been no question of splendor. Let others shine if they wished. She had spent too many years among inventories and broth kettles to imagine silk could repair what suspicion had bruised. Still, as she took her place, her hands were cold enough that she had to fold them hard together to keep them still. Then he entered. The Duke of Cairo, not the surveyor in a rain-marked coat or the quiet man in the almshouse office bending over her ledgers, came up the aisle in dark cloth of severe cut, with that same contained carriage she now understood had never belonged to an ordinary man at all. Yet when his gaze lifted and found her across the crowded church, just for a breath, she saw the man she had known still there beneath the title, and the knowledge hurt almost as much as it comforted. The service began. Prayers, psalms, the bishop's sermon on stewardship and neglect. Every word seemed to strike more than one target. The congregation listened with that dangerous stillness people wear when they know they may soon be part of the lesson. At last came the blessing. Susanna thought, wildly, that perhaps this was all, that the bishop's officers had handled the matter in chambers and papers, and she would go on being half-cleared forever. But before anyone could rise, the bishop turned from the altar and said, in a voice that carried to the very porch, "Be seated, if you please. There remains one matter of justice to be spoken before this congregation." The bishop let the silence deepen until even the smallest child in the back pew had gone still. Then he spoke first of the storm, of broken roofs and fallen stone, of bells silenced and work neglected too long. He spoke of stewardship and of the sin that wears the face of habit when men grow comfortable in duties they no longer examine. And then, before the whole congregation, he turned from the pulpit toward the nave where Susanna stood with her father. "It is also my office," he said, "to name honesty where it has been doubted." Every drop of blood seemed to leave her at once. He called her by name, not as one mentions a parish helper in passing. He spoke of the books she had kept for the poor with exactness others had mocked, and of the copies by which missing sums had first been traced. He said that when a certain gold signet had been found among the storm wreckage, Miss Fairley had returned it without bargain or reward, not knowing that it bore the personal seal of the Duke of Cairo, whose private intervention had preserved the church from further neglect. A murmur moved through the pews and died again. Then the bishop named the Duke fully, and the last veil fell from the stranger she had known. He did not linger upon rank. That was the mercy of it. Instead, he laid before the parish the plain sequence of truth. The church warden had diverted funds. The false entries had been proved. The widow's testimony, the clerk's confession, the recovered papers, and Miss Fairley's own records had together protected both the church and the poor from further injury. "Her conduct," the bishop said, looking directly over the congregation, "has been above reproach." Above reproach. The phrase passed through her like sunlight through winter glass. She did not cry at once. She could not. She only stood there while every whispered slight she had endured seemed to shrivel in the open air. Mr. Bletcham was removed from office that same morning. The curate read the formal notice with shaking hands. No one looked at him with pity enough to matter. And then the service moved to its final act. The new bell rope hung beside the tower arch, pale and clean against the old stone. The bishop spoke a prayer over the restored bells. When he finished, the Duke of Cairo stepped forward, not to take the honor himself, but to ask whether Miss Fairley would begin the ringing. A sound ran through the church. Surprise, then understanding. Susanna crossed the flags on unsteady feet. The rope was rough beneath her palm, new hemp with a little dust still clinging to it. For one heartbeat, she thought of ledgers, of coal scuttles, of broth kettles, of the wash-house grate and the broken ring in the rubble. Such small, exact things, yet they had held. She pulled. The bell answered at once, deep and living. It rolled up through the tower and out across the village, over the cottages, over the graves, over the lane where people had once smiled at her, as though usefulness were a kind of harmless failure. One bell became many. The whole peal opened above them, bright after silence. Later, when the crowd spilled into the churchyard and people who had doubted her found new words for admiration, the Duke came to her without attendance. No audience now, no concealment either. "I owed you truth much sooner," he said. "Yes," she answered, because she would not dress honesty in lace. He accepted that with the grave humility she had begun to understand was the strongest thing in him. Then he said, "If you will allow it, I should like to begin again. Not with disguise, not with debt, with work, and with asking leave to come to the almshouse tomorrow." The answer rose in her before shyness could interfere. "Come," she said. "The north roof still leaks." He laughed then, softly, and for the first time the sound belonged wholly to the man and not the title. Some people are not overlooked because they are small. They are overlooked because the world has grown lazy in its sight. Yet a careful hand on a worn page, a coal measure entered true, a ring returned to its owner without calculation. These are the things that outlast weather and pretense alike. By evening the churchyard had quieted. Rain-washed light rested on the repaired stone, and from the open almshouse window drifted the ordinary scent of bread, soap, and warm broth, as if the world had simply resumed its proper order. If this story stayed with you, you can let me know with a quiet word below. And if you'd like another long tale tomorrow night, stay near.